you guys have often spoken on the show. Each of you kind of have your own instances of obviously dealing with discrimination, be it race or sexuality or religion and whatnot. So I'm wondering, are you finding yourselves now, how you're taking your personal experiences and applying them? Because I've talked to some other friends about this, ones who look just like me, and we're like, this isn't about me. It's my time to shut up and just listen and help others. But I think there is also something to kind of the shared experience of, if you can relate in any way. So are you kind of feeling that yourselves, feeling like, something has happened to me, now's my time to use that? And
I personally, I think for me, this is purely me. I feel like telling my story isn't really the right time, and I do wonder if people sharing their stories is probably a little tone deaf to a certain extent. I feel like now is the time to be amplifying Black voices. Yes, all of us have experienced discrimination at some point based on what we have no control over. But I think that we are away from that right now, or we're a few probably weeks or months away from talking about that and making it about our plight. And so as far as I'm concerned, with it being Pride Month, talking about how the Black community is influenced the gay culture in the West in particular, and focusing on those stories instead of our own feels a lot more important than talking about our own experience. However, I will say this, one additional point, having immediate conversations within our own families or our groups of friends to be able to articulate what it does feel like to be marginalized, I think is important. And it's not saying that we understand the plight of our Black brethren. We're saying that we understand to a certain extent what it feels like to be discriminated against. Who are we to then discriminate against others? And by that, I'm talking about, in particular, our LGBTQ community.
Yeah, Gerrad, if I can, I fully 100% agree with Tan and everything he just said. But I would want to challenge you, Gerrad, to something. At the beginning of that question, you said that you and your friends have gotten to the place right now where you're like, this is our time to be quiet. And I understood what you meant by that, but I would actually encourage people who are listening in sort of a sentiment of what Tan just said, but taking it maybe one extent further, of making sure that as you're learning and as you're, being empathetic and as you're amplifying voices, you're not so silent with those friends, because I think those dialogues need to happen so much more, especially in groups of white people where, and especially groups of LGBT white people, where we sometimes forget that because we're part of the LGBT community, we forget that racism, sexism, discrimination against trans people, gender nonconforming people, it still runs rampant within our community. And I think it's very important for us to look at ourselves and check and to say, hey, we're allowing Black voices to be amplified right now. We're focusing on that struggle, but we also need to be checking and being like, hey, I noticed that all 5 of us all look the same. Why don't we have anybody else in this conversation that looks different, who could be Black, who could be any of those intersections, could be from a different religion, who could be disabled, who have a different gender identity? Why aren't they in this? And it's not about, for me, collecting friends, but it's about making sure that individuals who look like you are challenging what is in your environment by just looking around and having the conversation.
I think like on Queer Eye, when I think about every season that we've had and almost every single episode in one of like the interview portions, I call them Kardashian moments. I always try to figure out how I can relate to one of the heroes. And that's something that's kind of like been my MO with everything. But what I'm realizing with this is that because of my white privilege, it's not something that I can necessarily relate to. And it's kind of like this linear thing. It's like you educate, or I'm speaking for myself right now, but like you educate yourself and then you figure out how you can be an ally. What can you actually help with? What's appropriate? What isn't appropriate? A lot of missteps along the way, but thankfully I have people who I can lean to and resources that I have to make sure that I'm just doing my best and trying not to botch it as I go along. But it's definitely a work in progress. But yeah.
I also think that white privilege and white supremacy thrives in silence. So by allowing your friends to not speak about it, like So obviously, so for instance, like I have been talking about my HIV status lately. I mean, like yesterday, well, I don't know when this is coming up, but recently it was, National HIV Testing Day. And so I did, and it's been HIV AIDS. There was like HIV AIDS Day. There's always a gorgeous day on awareness. But the point is that we were talking a lot about like U equals U, untransmittable equals undetectable, and how amazing that is. But the problem is that in so much of the United States, because of really inherently racist state legislatures, especially Black and brown men cannot get access to these medications because of all of the bureaucratic hoops that these state legislatures put in. And then like the federal government also does some things to help, but actually like, especially with Trump, much more to hurt. So it's such a multi-layered thing to talk about. And I think that if you are white, it's important to think about how your privilege affects your access to healthcare, housing, all of those things. And then when you're talking, because there's this other really annoying thing when talking about race where it's like white people sometimes tend to listen to white people. We tend to listen to people who look like us. So sometimes white people do need to hear from other white people. You know, it was kind of easier for me to do this because of these things. These are the reasons why it's harder for Black and brown people. And it's our duty to have those uncomfortable conversations. It is a privilege to sit around silently. And we cannot do that. And we cannot choose to, I believe for myself, that we can't choose to not talk about systemic racism and white supremacy in this country because it's uncomfortable. And it's not going to end in June, and it's not going to end in July. I mean, the talking about it. So, you know, we have to keep really talking about it because it has been a silent, that's how it thrives, you know, is this like whole silent thing. So that's what I think about it.